Before McLaren was around in the 70s, you know, the music in Britain was legendarily sort of divorced from its audience. I mean, Bowie had probably been the last person that had sort of touched an audience in any way with glam rock, and people would paint themselves and go to his gigs, but he'd sort of decamped to America. And so people felt quite disenfranchised, and you could feel that something needed to happen. And McLaren was one of those people who he just picked up on the feeling of the time.
There were people who shared with McLaren a frustration with what music had become, how it had become divorced from, in McLaren's terminology, probably the insurrectionary spirit of rock and roll. Everything had become big, unwieldy. The music was removed from the people that it was supposed to be heard by and enjoyed by. So McLaren wasn't unique in his viewpoint, but it became an absolutely essential catalyst for what happened in 1975, 76, and especially 77.
McLaren had nothing really to do with the music. I mean, McLaren was a kind of, I suppose you'd call him in retrospect, a visionary, and that he understood. He'd been to art college, and he kind of grasped the idea of what they call situationalism, if I can say that. The situationist is easier to say, which effectively meant that you kind of went against the grain. Anything that was happening, you did the opposite, and you sort of created as much chaos as you could.
I think he saw what was happening as a potential for great rock and roll theatre. And he might have seen himself as an impresario or a director of what was going to happen. I think he did have a very vivid vision of what music could be, the music that became punk, or what we recognise as punk. I was at a lot of the early Sex Pistols gigs, and although frankly they were pretty parlous on any kind of musical level, what they were doing you quickly recognised and quickly felt just went beyond the normal kind of vocabulary of rock and roll technique. They weren't great musicians, but everything they did had an incredible blazing energy, and however intimidating it originally seemed, once people like myself who were kind of like, well, do I like this or do I not like it, whether you liked it seemed irrelevant. It was happening, and you were either part of it or you retreated wildly from it and ran to the hills screaming like a lot of people around me did.
Now, McLaren sort of sat behind the scenes, and he realised that, you know, this was just making headlines, and all he was interested in was making headline after headline after headline. And if people got hurt along the way, well, so be it, because that's kind of what revolution for him was about. So he was really the person, I think, who created the kind of arena in which the Sex Pistols and then punk could flourish.
He gave it the identity that I think it probably would have lacked had those bands just somehow drifted together. There wouldn't have been a sense of perhaps of a movement, and however much we think of it as a movement in retrospect, and we might doubt that it really was a movement, he did give it a sense of an upheaval, a dramatic upheaval. Punk was the biggest upheaval that we'd known in British music since, you know, the Beatles came along, probably.
Music has never been the same since Malcolm McLaren invented the Sex Pistols, because although it may not count in big bucks, there's a certain idea now that there's a kind of us and a them, that there's music that's made purely for commercial gain, and there's music that's made for something else, albeit whether it's antagonistic or to say something. And McLaren sort of brought those kind of us and them and that kind of schism right to the fore, and it's never really gone away, and I think that's what we owe him. The fact that, you know, there's such things as good and bad music is down pretty much to Malcolm McLaren.